Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my honor to introduce my mentor and teacher, Mr. John Ryan.
Thank you, Catherine. And thank you to the committee, the Words of Wisdom Committee.
Thank you for that, St. Louis! Yes, it's taking effect.
Thank you also to Dr. Wilkinson and Dr. Lassus, to the other speakers who have already spoken and are yet to come, and also to the audience in particular. Thanks for taking time out of your busy lives to hear some humble words from me. Incidentally, the music you heard, actually I kind of looped accidentally, I guess. It's an Irish band called the Pogues. Okay, I thought someone would be, oh, Dublin, or something. All right, so here we go. One of my earliest memories is of a man dying before my eyes. I didn't know he was dying at the time, at least not in the way I would know he was dying at age 12 or 18 or now 40. I was about 3 years old enough to be excited for a plane trip from my native Los Angeles to St. Louis, old enough to know my mom and dad had a mom and dad too, old enough to realize that the man in the mustard-colored sweater listing to one side on an old couch was my grandpa Ryan, Dad's dad. In my memory of him, a memory no doubt bleached and tinted and retinted by remembering the original memory, he has a grimace on his face and he's holding his side. He leans sideways. And my grandma's on the couch next to him, smiling at me. She's a nurse. She has her hair up in a tight bun, but is dressed casually, or perhaps darkly. Her figure is a smudge that memory did not bother with. He has the magnificently colored sweater, bright and tawny, over a rumpled white shirt and tie. His thick whitening hair is swept back, Clint Eastwood style, when Clint still had a full head. And his eyebrows are dark, dark like his squinting eyes, semi-closed in pain. Black Irish, this man, dark-featured. And my grandma, dark-featured too, though olive-skinned, last name Lanter, from the Italian de Lantera, and olive, pressed through the German immigrant agricultural mills in Millstock, Illinois. In the other half of the memory, I'm in a plane rising from the ground at night. The blue of the runway lights is the most dazzling, beautiful thing I've ever seen. Attached to this image is the notion that somehow I could see Grandma and Grandpa Ryan's property from the air. A 1.5-story rambling house with green asbestos shingle siding, enclosed by trees and wild shrubs, one gravel drive away from a big open barn, a derelict Airstream trailer, some goats and chickens, uphill from a pond, and a creek you crossed on a single-lane wooden bridge with no railings, all contained within 8 acres of woods, a short, improbable distance from modernist South County shopping mall. I might have filled in those other details over the years, after many, many visits to Grandma's house, which was sort of over the river and definitely through the woods. But I never got to know Grandpa Ryan. That was to be the only meeting with him I recollect, though I understand he held me when I was an infant. Here was a man who was on a destroyer escort at Iwo Jima, who fathered 6 children, my dad the oldest, who had a law degree but followed in the family tradition, dating back to his great-grandfather, a literal teamster with a team of horses stringing line for the telephone company, of working for Ma Bell. Here was a man who helped engineer the installation of the telephone lines in the Gateway Arch. He died within the year. In another memory, back in our brightly lit kitchen on Midvale Avenue in Los Angeles, California, my mom passes the phone to my dad, who stretches the cord to its limit as he talks with his mom. My mom says, "Dad will be gone for a few days, hon. Grandpa Ryan died." I want to share with you today the idea of the memento mori, a Latin phrase that essentially means remember that you are mortal, or more plainly and rather frankly, remember that you will die. In painting, the classic symbols of the memento mori include the figure of death as a skeleton, a scythe, an hourglass, or sometimes all three. My purpose here is not to depress you, or alarm you, or cast a dark cloud over what's left of this beautiful day. Rather, I wish to remind you that life is finite. Unlike other finite things, paradoxically, life's finite boundary is one we cannot see. It is a boundary too often, though, we seem to see through, as though we're not there. Minute by minute, day by day, year by year, as we grow and learn and make mistakes and love and hurt, and we hope grow wiser before our last goodbye. We live in a culture of distraction, of bright, pretty things flashing before our avid eyes in a continuous stream. When we're plugged in, we forget our mortality. I'm not against plugging in, categorically, but when the dazzling stream is all that sustains us, and we cannot pause for fear of missing out on something virtual, we lose what's real. The ideal memento mori reminds us of what's real. More, it commands us to remember and cherish what is real. I'm 40 years old, at the statistical midpoint of my life. Dante, before entering the Inferno, was halfway through his biblical 10, that is 35. I'm happy to report that 700 years later, male life expectancy in developed countries has grown by 10 years. At that slow rate, we may indeed someday live forever, or what feels like forever. But that will require calculations that take into account the long-term habitability of our planet, the likelihood of avoiding a catastrophic asteroid strike, overpopulation, ice melt, air pollution, the 5 billion year shelf life of our sun, and ape revolutions, and zombie apocalypse. So I'll leave that kind of thinking to the theoretical mathematicians and conspiracy theorists. We're here to concentrate on the human lifespan, not some cosmic scale or end-of-days prophecy. Today I want to introduce you to a few people whom I have known, loved, and in most cases, lost. They comprise my own memento mori. But unlike the classic representations of memento mori, I don't remember mortality with a skull or a scythe or an hourglass. I remember the preciousness of life through the impression of these people's lives upon mine. And with hope, because here on earth, unlike in Dante's Inferno, as my AP students well know, there is always hope. Their lives, I hope, lived through my words, will remind you of the preciousness of your own lives and the lives of the ones you love. My wife and I met in Columbia, Missouri, at Mizzou. All right, state school. We had simultaneously entered a kind of philosophical discussion group run by a puckish short undergrad named Jeff, a future cult leader, if ever there was one. Our group, a rather motley lot, met in unusual places to talk about serious issues and also weighty matters. Once, Jeff's roommate Matt made some stir fry, which we munched by candlelight in Jeff's basement apartment. Another time we climbed a tree to have our salon. The most memorable meeting, though, involved entering a cave at night, turning off all the flashlights and discussing what we each feared the most. Jeff and I drove pizzas for Shakespeare's. My future wife, Dee, worked at a metaphysical bookstore, a place of crystals and incense and inner goddesses. Matt was unhinged and brilliant, but unemployed. Dave, a real philosophy major, also unemployed, had a mental breakdown one night in front of us. And witnessing that and how we dealt with it, it still chills me. After I lost touch with them, I heard Jeff and Dave had joined an actual cult of the rural mid-Missouri sort, with an older leader whom they'd spoken of in reverential terms. I'm assuming they're no longer part of it. Last I heard, Jeff was a long-haul trucker. Now, the philosophy club might not have lasted, but Dee and I did. At the time we met, I was dating another young woman named Dana, a dangerous oddball, whom I considered alluring and mysterious, though she seemed to repel most people who got to know her. I saw Dee, my future wife, as attractive, but also as a new friend and not a romantic interest. I would tell her about my woes involving Dana. She would listen sympathetically. To her credit, she never told me to dump her or call Dana an idiot. She just listened, giving me the space to figure out for myself that Dana was plain nuts. And Dee was actually very cool. The night I made my decision to break free, I pounded on Dana's door, deposited the artsy black and white, semi-nude, 8x10 photo of herself she'd given me on the step, and stormed off in a dramatic huff. The first place I could think to go was Dee's apartment. But when I got there, I heard too many other voices inside, and I wandered away by myself. But without Dana in the picture, Dee and I let our attraction grow. Or rather, the attraction permitted us to go to school and work when it was not compelling us to be together. My last semester at Mizzou, she'd already finished her degree and moved back to St. Louis to start a job as a store manager and occasionally tend to her ailing mother. We came close to breaking up during that time. I hate to think about that. The morning after a long-distance call one Friday night that ended miserably for both of us, I came back to my lousy apartment from the Columbia Farmers Market to a phone message from Dee. My mother has died. I'm going to need you. I drove immediately to St. Louis. I consoled Dee and shared her family's grief, and she and I patched things up. My subsequent visits to St. Louis on weekends were more exquisite, sometimes solemn, always too short. We made plans to share her apartment together when I graduated in December. Always the promise of rekindling our love in the same town sparkled on the dark horizon of impending winter. I graduated. I moved in. I began to look for a job. A month or so later, Dee and I decided that following the strain of the last semester, we should get away, really get away. She'd read about a place called the Grateful Bed and Breakfast in Luquillo, Puerto Rico. Photos revealed a whitewashed set of humble bungalows on a slope facing El Yunque, the verdant peak that juts out of the rainforest. Photos in a magazine, mind you. No intranet, as we know it today, to browse. I didn't even have email. Only one person I knew did, and he was insane. We booked our flight and made our reservations using an old-fashioned telephone. Marty, who ran the B&B, was an ex-Brooklynite, a former politician, and a consummate punster and joker. We have a photo of him wielding a pickaxe. You can't take it seriously, though. A bearded dwarf in a tie-dye t-shirt would be more frightening. In Luquillo, Puerto Rico, Dee and I explored the rainforest, sprawled on the beach, listened to music, and just generally relaxed. Within a few days, Marty was offering me a job there. I was ready to seriously consider it. Spanish and English major that I was. As before with Dana, Dee kept quiet about what could have likely been a very poor decision had I followed through with it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. One morning, Marty offered to take me through a little explored stretch of forest to see the more primitive side of the mountain jungle and maybe talk about what working for him would be like. Dee was content to remain behind to swing in the hammock and read. Marty and I, with backpacks of water and some food, plus, as it was to find out, the New York Times crossword puzzle, drove up the winding rain-slick mountain road to a gravel parking area, set out on a kind of trail marked only intermittently by wooden stakes spray-painted orange. The hike was magnificent. No one else around. Oranges hanging from trees that you could just bat down with your walking stick. So juicy they ran like a tap through your fingers. Bananas ripening in abundance, long-feathered, cinnamon-colored birds darting through the canopy, rivers bounding over boulders, red puffballs of fragrant flowers suspended from delicate trees. We hiked and chatted, at first aimlessly, then purposefully, as the conversation shifted to what I might bring to the enterprise known as the Grateful Bed and Breakfast. As the heat of the day accumulated and the sweat of human exertion became overwhelming, we decided to take a dip in a pool formed by one of those rushing rivers. Now, you must understand this, especially those of you who are minors in the crowd. At a certain age, most people lose a degree of self-consciousness. Some lose 1 degree and part their hair a different way after 20 years. Others lose dozens of degrees of self-consciousness and really go off the deep end, starring in reality TV or running for political office. At the age of 22, I was somewhere in between. A bit radical, maybe more towards the reality TV side, but not so shameless. The point I'm working up to is this. Marty and I had not brought swimming trunks. We'd only known each other a few days. He might be tendering me a serious job offer. We were in the middle of the rainforest with no one else around. And we were about to take off our clothes and go skinny dipping. Yeah, so we did it. This is not the first time I did such a thing in a natural setting. At that age, I had merely a moment's hesitation, and that was it. Hot day, cool water? Yes. Naked in front of the funny bearded Brooklyn guy? So be it. It was too hot not to dip in. Now, my wife will tell you I'm not a big swimmer. I love water, but I kind of like drying in the sun more than I like splashing around. After a few minutes, I sat on a sun-drenched rock, contemplating the river, the mountainous views, hearing unidentifiable birds cry out in flight. Marty emerged from the water minutes later and sat down next to me. And there we were, 2 men in the buff, sitting on a big rock, in the middle of nowhere. It was more relaxing than you might think. That's when Marty reached into his bag and pulled out the New York Times crossword. He said something to me like, I'd like to take just a few minutes more to sit here. At the time, a naked man asking permission to complete the Times crossword puzzle did not seem so unusual. I consented and continued my nature reverie. A few more minutes passed. Marty looked up from the puzzle, cleared his throat, and broke the silence. You know, if you'd like to work with me, there's something you should know. Okay. He peered at me for a moment. And that is then I'm gay. I'm at a loss for how to describe this moment. I'll trust you still have the mental image of the rock and the two of us. Marty must have sensed my awkwardness. Are you okay with that? He asked. I assured him I was, which was true. It was true then, it would be true now. The fact of his being gay was not an obstacle to friendship or employment for me. However, this was the first time in my life a person, male or female, had come out to me. In addition to the circumstances we were in, the sun had just disappeared behind the mountaintop. With its decline, the mood had shifted too, imperceptibly but palpably. Marty noted we should probably be heading back. We dressed, grabbed our bags, and began to hunt out the trail. Now the trail, if you recall, was really just an idea, pockmarked by occasional orange stakes. As we wandered, we lost sight of them. Marty, in addition to clothes, now wore a contemplative look. Let's try this way. We wandered some more. Maybe back by the river we can pick up the trail. So back we went. You know, one time a friend and I had to spend the night in the forest. That's so. Yeah, it got a little cold. What did you do? Wrapped up in banana tree leaves and waited it out. As cool as I was with Marty's recent admission to me, I did not want to sleep out in the open wrapped in leaves. In the jungle, there was a light downpour every 15 minutes. And what about Dee? She would worry. This was a pre-cell phone age, too. GPS? GPS could stand for Great Protein Shake, for all I know. We were on a trail that I now learned had probably washed away thanks to the previous hurricane season. I started to get worried. Occasions when I had been lost as a child flooded over me, and I concealed rising panic with a nervous smile. Eventually we followed the river and far enough that the sun, well, it truly was setting, and we found the trail. Actually, another trail, laid by human hands and not beaten down by wild boars or something. By the way, there are no wild boars in Puerto Rico. Just a lot of stray dogs, actually tons. Anyway, I'm standing here today, so you know that I got out. But I still gave real thought to Marty's job offer. After Dee and I returned to St. Louis, I decided to take it. We would do a 3-month trial. During that time, Dee would be able to visit, and if it didn't pan out, working for Marty, no hard feelings. I bought my plane ticket. Dee and I realized we'd be putting our relationship on hold once more, but she understood, I think, that living in a Spanish-speaking country was one of my postgraduate dreams. My parents threw a bon voyage dinner. It was spring. And St. Louis in the spring is the most beautiful place to be in this country. My mom and I took a walk after dinner. And as we rounded the last block, the redbud boughs highlighting the air, I announced, "Mom, I'm not going to go." "No?" "No, I changed my mind. I'm not going to go." And you know what? I'm not sure why I changed my mind. We returned to my parents' home. I spread the news. Dee was perplexed, if memory serves, but I know she was glad. I made the difficult call to Marty, who was also perplexed and maybe a little miffed, but the plane would take off the next morning without me. Some years later, Dee and I got married at the zoo. We stood under a swooping pteranodon in the living world, reciting vows we wrote ourselves with the blessings of a Unitarian minister and an assembly of close friends and family. After a short ceremony, we all went downstairs to celebrate beneath the plastered great white shark and the giant squid. For our honeymoon, we went back to Luquillo, Puerto Rico, back to the grateful bed and breakfast, and back to Marty. In the interim, he had hired a guy his own age from Ohio to help out. Marty was the same old self, and there were clearly no hard feelings about my 11th hour decision not to come work for him a few years prior. Plus, we were paying customers after all. I wish Marty could still be in our lives. If only every couple of years for us to be able to visit him in Luquillo. But he died. He died when his bungalow on the grounds caught on fire one night. Dee found out by total happenstance some months afterwards. when we were contemplating another trip. And around that time, I think it was, I learned that Dana, the young woman I'd broken up with for D back in Columbia, had collapsed and died in a Denver shopping mall of a drug overdose. Unlike a grandfather I barely knew or a great aunt I'd seen once or twice, these were people with whom I'd had very intimate moments, very important moments, seminal moments in my young adulthood. Dana's a reminder of the dangers of excess. Marty's a reminder, though, of what? Changing your smoke detector batteries? I wish I could have learned something from Marty to pass on to someone else. Dean, our friend and favorite bartender at Riddle's penultimate restaurant. Dean also died in a fire, apparently because he fell asleep smoking a cigarette in bed. The paramedics found his body by the door of his locked apartment. Life is precious. Life is a gift you cannot store on a shelf or return with or without a receipt. You can't replace it when it breaks. You keep taping it up. You keep trying to erase the smudges that are really scars, and you go on. My firstborn daughter, very much alive, Irene, is now nearly 14 years old. My mom's dad, Grandpa Joe, got to hold her when she was less than a month old. We have a picture of her squalling in his arms, but the look on his face is nearly beatific. He'd been diagnosed with terminal cancer at the time. He was 95 years old. Here was a man who remembered seeing pilots exposed in the air in primitive aircraft, flying at low altitude when he was a boy. A man who saw Charles Lindbergh at Aviation Field in Forest Park, watched the moon launch on television, and witnessed the comings and goings of the space shuttle. My mom had become his primary caregiver, and her siblings decided that hospice care was the way to go. That meant he would die in his own home, and not the home on 25th Street in North St. Louis, but his last home, an apartment in Kirkwood. I recall the day he died, and this is the first time I've put it into words and now spoken them. My mom was there, her sister, and a nurse. My cousins appeared one by one to say goodbye. Was he already gone? The person, I mean? The sparkling man who ate bacon every day and took a shot of whiskey before noon as a matter of course. Who taught me, you always say, ah, after you take a sip of beer. Every sip, not just the first. His eyes were closed, his false teeth were out, and his mouth hung open as though it might be about to consume something, though he was the one being consumed from the inside out. The death rattle sounded regular and ominously from deep in his fragile chest. I waited mostly in the tiny living room, while family, such as my sister, tread into his bedroom, then emerged tearful or distraught, or both, to then drive back to work or to school. Grandpa's younger son, John, announced at one point he was leaving. He had to go get a hamburger. He would not see his father alive again. The nurse came from his room and quietly announced that it was almost time. My mom, her sister, Dee, our infant daughter Irene in her arms, and I assembled around his bed. The rattle was more pronounced. His face contorted for a moment. My hand rubbed his feet. As if we had prepared to do so, we all began telling him, it's okay, it's okay. Let it go. His body seemed to seize up. My daughter cried once, fell asleep. He was gone. Aside from the births of my two children, witnessing a natural death was the most profound and moving experience I can imagine having as a human being. The two experiences, birth, death, in fact, are more similar than I can possibly relate. Grandpa Joe's beloved cuckoo clock, featuring two woodmen sawing a log, stopped of its own accord sometime as he died. When the paramedics came to take away the sheet-covered body on the stretcher, my daughter Irene woke up, and she laughed. She laughed for the very first time in her 4-month-old life. I'd like to think she laughed because she was alive. She laughed because a balloon meant to cheer up Grandpa Joe instead delighted and entranced her. And then us as well. This young life that we had shepherded into the world just 4 months before, and this old life we had just shepherded out of the world. They conflated into one beautiful spirit, one recognition of the preciousness of life. Remember that sometimes. When life pains you, there's wisdom in laughter, even the laughter of an infant. Between the years of my young adulthood and now, I've had many other trials. Everybody does. A college friend was murdered. My mom survived breast cancer. My father, who weathered melanoma once, is now battling it again. After surgery last week, he will return to surgery again this Friday. And I had my own brush with mortality 3 summers ago. And I'm glad I listened to my heart instead of ignoring it. The artery that feeds oxygen to the heart, the left anterior descending artery, was 95% blocked. I underwent an emergency procedure to prop it open with an angioplasty and a metal stent. And thanks to Dr. John Hess, I now have my own memento mori right here. But I'm not sad, and I'm not depressed. I start every day by saying, today is a good day. Every day above ground is a good day. But today in particular is a good day. And so I will close this day with a suggestion. As you grow and learn and make mistakes and love and hurt, and I hope grow wise, find your own memento mori. Find your own reminder of the preciousness of life. And instead of an object, perhaps, find it in attachment to and love of another person. Thank you.